Blue and red emergency lights painted wild patterns across my swimming pool as half a dozen squad cars blocked our driveway. A birthday cake bobbed upside down in the shallow end, while an inflatable unicorn drifted lazily against the pool steps, creating an eerie, squeaking sound with each gentle collision. Margaret, wearing her signature power suit, wielded a bullhorn like she was commanding a military operation rather than disrupting a child's party. "This gathering violates multiple residential codes," she announced through the megaphone. "Law enforcement has been contacted regarding these infractions." The responding officers looked bewildered, clearly wondering why they'd been summoned. To what appeared to be an ordinary backyard celebration complete with decorations, refreshments, and confused neighbors gathering to watch the spectacle. Then something unexpected happened. From our patio door emerged the governor's wife, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, casually draping a beach towel over her arm as she addressed the lead officer. "I'd like to file a complaint about harassment and filing false reports," she said calmly. The police officers exchanged glances. Margaret's face began shifting through several shades of red as she realized her carefully orchestrated moment of authority had just taken an unexpected turn. What she didn't know was that she had just triggered the most explosive HOA scandal our community had ever witnessed. If you're following this story, drop a comment about your own neighborhood drama. I'm curious how widespread these community power struggles really are. Trust me, you haven't heard anything yet. 3 hours earlier, setting up paradise that morning had been perfect as I arranged Emma's pool celebration. Hanging streamers in, her favorite coral shade, the same color she'd chosen for her bedroom after completing chemotherapy. The oncologist had confirmed she was cancer-free. But any parent who's walked through pediatric cancer treatment knows that relief never fully replaces vigilance. Every birthday feels it's miraculous when you've spent 2 years uncertain whether there would be future birthdays to celebrate. The pool area looked like a watercolor dream with floating flamingos, color-changing LED lights, and enough pool toys to stock a water park. Emma had insisted on inviting everyone who helped during her treatment, creating a guest list that included her entire medical team, tutors who provided schooling during hospital stays, and neighbors who brought meals during our darkest months. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Emma's lead oncologist, had surprised us by attending after her hospital shift. I'd extended the invitation months earlier when we weren't certain Emma would reach her 13th birthday, and somehow it had remained in Dr. Mitchell's schedule. Over 2 years of treatment, Sarah had become more than Emma's physician. She'd been our anchor during moments when everything felt chaotic and uncertain. She'd mentioned casually that her spouse worked in state politics, though I hadn't focused on those details. Government officials seemed to exist in a completely different realm from parents, navigating cancer treatment and suburban community conflicts. Driving home from my final grocery run that morning, I noticed something peculiar about the traffic signal at the main intersection near our subdivision. The timing sequence seemed irregular, the yellow warning light flickering in a pattern that didn't match standard municipal programming from my years as a traffic systems engineer. This was the same intersection where my wife Lisa had died too. Years earlier, in what authorities had classified as an unfortunate accident involving faulty traffic controls, I'd spent months after her death studying the city's traffic management data, convinced something wasn't right about the timing protocols that evening. But I could never locate definitive proof of tampering. The investigation had been swift, conclusive, and left me with questions that never quite resolved. But today wasn't for dwelling on past tragedies. Today celebrated that my daughter was still here, still fighting, still making terrible jokes about her wig collection, asking if she could dye her new hair growth purple. The campaign of harassment Margaret had launched her systematic assault on our family almost immediately after we'd relocated to Willowbrook Heights, coinciding perfectly with Emma's cancer diagnosis, turning our world upside down. Initially, it seemed like typical HOA micromanagement, the kind of petty enforcement that makes suburban living feel like existing under constant scrutiny from someone with excessive time and insufficient compassion. She would measure our lawn height with precise instruments, document the exact positioning of our trash containers, and somehow consistently discover violations in our landscaping decisions. When Emma became ill, and yard maintenance became secondary to keeping our daughter alive, Margaret's complaints intensified with surgical precision. She'd contact city officials about our deteriorating property standards. How my daughter underwent chemotherapy. She'd demand emergency board meetings to discuss our negative impact on neighborhood values. While I slept in uncomfortable hospital chairs, praying my child would see another sunrise, but today felt different. Watching her pace behind our fence, her clipboard thick with what appeared to be legal documentation, I realized this wasn't about grass length or garbage placement. This had become personal. The way she monitored her house, the calculated timing of her complaints, the methodical precision of her harassment, everything suggested someone who'd been orchestrating this confrontation for weeks. Margaret had been documenting our alleged violations with the dedication of someone building a court case, photographing our property from multiple angles, recording timestamps of our supposed noise violations, and maintaining what appeared to be a comprehensive surveillance record of our family's daily activities. The perfect storm the pool party had been proceeding wonderfully until approximately 2 p.m. When Margaret emerged from her house like a general preparing for combat, she was dressed in what I could only describe as formal business attire for an HOA enforcement action navy blazer, clipboard, measuring equipment, and a police-issued megaphone that I was fairly certain civilians weren't authorized to possess. The celebration had begun at 1 p.m. with a reasonable number of guests, appropriate party music, and the kind of joyful energy that accompanies celebrating a cancer survivor's birthday. But Margaret's approach wasn't about noise levels or crowd size. This was about power, control, what felt like a personal vendetta against our family's happiness. Everything crystallized as she raised that megaphone, her voice carrying across the neighborhood with the authority of someone who believed she held all the advantages. Mr. Davidson believes he can disregard community regulations, but I've documented 14 separate violations occurring simultaneously at this unauthorized gathering, Margaret announced, reading from her clipboard like she was delivering a judicial verdict. The most disturbing aspect was how prepared she seemed. Like she'd been planning this public confrontation for weeks, waiting for the perfect opportunity to publicly humiliate our family on what should have been one of our happiest days. The crowd of neighbors who had gathered, initially curious about the police presence, were now witnessing what felt like a carefully orchestrated public shaming designed to question our family's right to exist peacefully in the community. Margaret's accusations weren't just about party violations. They targeted our family's fundamental right to live without harassment. Excessive noise during residential hours, unauthorized use of amplification devices, overcrowding and violation of density restrictions, failure to obtain proper permits for large gatherings, she continued. Each charge delivered with the precision of someone who'd spent considerable time researching municipal codes and community bylaws. The tables turn, that's when Detective Marcus Rodriguez, a veteran officer with compassionate eyes and the patience of someone who'd witnessed every variety of neighborhood conflict, examined Margaret's list and looked back at her with something approaching professional amusement. "Ma'am, are you aware that 9 of these 14 violations don't exist in your community charter?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough volume for the gathering crowd to hear. "I've handled numerous HOA disputes, and this is either a significant misunderstanding or something else entirely." The expression on Margaret's face at that moment, the slight flush creeping up her neck as she realized her carefully prepared legal ammunition had just backfired in front of half the neighborhood, should have been my first indication that we were dealing with something far more complex than a controlling neighbor with excessive free time. Watching Margaret's face cycle through confusion, embarrassment, and then determined doubling down as Detective Rodriguez dismantled her fictional violations was like observing someone realize they'd brought inadequate weapons to a serious confrontation. She clutched her clipboard tighter, her knuckles whitening as she insisted that poolside gatherings exceeding 6 people require special permits under Municipal Code 847, and amplified music during daytime hours violates Residential Noise Ordinances Section 12. The problem with fabricating laws to a police officer is that officers generally understand what the actual laws are. Detective Rodriguez wasn't accepting any of it. "Ma'am, I need you to step back from the fence and lower your voice. There's no legal basis for it. Any of your complaints, and frankly." That's when Margaret made her first major legal mistake. Instead of calling a lawyer, she doubled down with righteous fury. "You don't understand what I've sacrificed for this community," she shouted, her composure finally cracking. "I've spent years protecting these families from themselves, making sure the wrong kind of people don't destroy what we've built here. This neighborhood was perfect before all these problem families started moving in with their medical drama, their financial instability, their constant crises that bring down everyone's property values." Each word was digging her legal grave deeper. She seemed incapable of stopping. The Miller family was running an illegal daycare. The Cheens were operating a restaurant out of their garage. And don't get me started on what the Johnsons were doing with their supposed book club meetings. I documented everything just like Robert taught me to do. The mention of Robert teaching her documentation methods sent a visible chill through Sarah, who immediately pulled out her phone and started typing urgent messages. The unraveling Margaret continued, out realizing she was incriminating herself and Robert in a federal conspiracy. "I have files on every family in this neighborhood, their vulnerabilities, their financial situations, their medical information, and their family problems. Someone has to keep track of who belongs here and who doesn't." Detective Rodriguez was writing furiously, documenting admissions of surveillance, harassment, and potentially illegal access to private information. But what chilled me most was when Margaret turned toward Emma and said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "Even smart little girls don't understand everything they think they see. Some problems require adult solutions that children can't comprehend." The implicit threat toward my daughter made every protective instinct flare to life. Margaret continued. "Robert calls it community curation, and it's been very effective. 25 families have learned to respect community standards or found somewhere else to live. Your family was always going to be number 26, Mr. Davidson." That's when Robert Hayes' phone rang, cutting through Margaret's increasingly unhinged monologue. He answered it on speaker, probably by accident in his panic. And a voice that carried federal authority filled our backyard. "Hayes, this is Agent Williams with the FBI. Operation Willow is complete. We have warrants for both you and Margaret Whitmore. Surrender yourself immediately at the federal building downtown or we're coming to get you within the hour." Robert's face went from politician pale to corpse white as he realized his phone conversation was being broadcast to everyone present. Margaret looked at Robert with betrayed shock, learning about Operation Willow and federal warrants at the same time. As the rest of us, the true scope of the arrival of Robert Hayes at our pool party had seemed random. But watching him try to simultaneously manage a federal investigation phone call while standing in my backyard in a $3,000 suit, I realized nothing about this situation was coincidental. Robert was sweating through his expensive shirt. Despite the cool evening air, his political smile completely abandoned as he kept glancing between Margaret and the growing crowd of neighbors, like he was calculating escape routes. "Agent Williams, this is a misunderstanding," he said into his phone, apparently forgetting. It was still on speaker. The Sunset Ridge project was completely legitimate, and any irregularities were due to Mrs. Whitmore's overzealous interpretation of community development goals. Margaret's face at hearing herself thrown under the bus by her supposed ally was a masterpiece of betrayed rage. But Robert wasn't finished destroying their partnership in front of half the neighborhood. Sarah stepped closer to Robert, and I could see the prosecutor in her coming out, the side that had been hidden behind years of gentle medical consultations with my daughter. "Mr. Hayes, I believe we've met before. You were quite vocal in opposing the new children's hospital wing that my husband and I have been advocating for. Something about misallocated municipal resources and questionable federal spending priorities. If I remember correctly, Robert's attempt to recover his political composure was painful to watch. Like seeing someone try to rebuild a house of cards in a hurricane. Mrs. Mitchell, what a pleasant surprise. I had no idea you'd be attending this gathering. Perhaps we could discuss the hospital project at a more appropriate time and place, away from this neighborhood drama." But Sarah wasn't here for political small talk, and her response revealed the true scope of what was happening. "This is the perfect time and place because your opposition to that hospital funding is directly connected to the Sunset Ridge development. And the federal healthcare database you've been illegally accessing to target vulnerable families? Connection? That's when the pieces started clicking together for me in a way that made my engineer's brain hurt with the implications. Robert's consistent support for Margaret's increasingly aggressive community enforcement wasn't about community standards or property values. It was about systematically pushing out families who might oppose specific development projects or ask inconvenient questions about municipal spending priorities. Families, like mine, who might wonder why a children's hospital was being defunded, while private development projects got fast-tracked, approval through city planning commissions. Margaret wasn't just a control-freak neighbor with too much time on her hands. She was a weapon carefully aimed at families that stood in the way of Robert's political and financial interests. "You've been using the community association to eliminate opposition to your development deals," said the words coming out before I'd fully processed the implications. "Every family Margaret has targeted, we all have something in common, don't we? We all either work in city government, have connections to healthcare funding, or live on properties you want for development." Robert tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out forced and hollow like a politician's rehearsed response to an unexpected scandal. "Mr. Davidson, that's quite an imagination you have there. Mrs. Whitmore operates independently, and any correlation between community enforcement and municipal development is purely coincidental." But Margaret was staring at Robert with the look of someone who was just realizing she'd been played by a master manipulator, someone who'd been using her deepest psychological vulnerabilities for his financial gain. "Robert, you told me these families were threats to community stability. You said I was protecting our property values and our way of life." Her voice carried the hurt of someone who genuinely believed she was doing the right thing, even as she'd been systematically destroying her neighbors' lives. "You gave me their insurance information, their medical records, and their financial vulnerabilities. You said it was public information that any concerned community member could access through proper channels." The shell game Sarah pulled out what looked like a tablet, swiping through documents with the efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for months. "Mrs. Whitmore, were you aware that 17 of the properties in your community jurisdiction are owned by shell companies controlled by Mr. Hayes' development group? Companies that give him controlling votes in any community association decision, and which have been systematically purchasing properties from families you've harassed into selling below market value?" Margaret's confusion was genuine and devastating to watch. "What are you talking about?" "Robert doesn't own property in Willowbrook Heights. He lives in the governor's district." Sarah turned the tablet toward her, showing property records, corporate filings, and bank transfers that painted a picture of systematic fraud spanning multiple years and dozens of properties. "He owns 17 ghost houses through shell companies. Mrs. Whitmore, properties purchased through fraudulent means, never occupied, existing only to give him voting control over your community board and legal justification for the harassment. Campaigns you've been conducting against innocent families." The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow, and I watched her face cycle through disbelief, understanding, and then rage as she processed that every decision she'd fought for, every family she'd targeted, every enforcement action she'd taken had been orchestrated by someone who was using her as a front for real estate, manipulation, and political corruption. Robert had been playing a longer game than any of us had realized, using Margaret's genuine neurosis about community control to clear out opposition to his development schemes, while simultaneously building a network of shell properties that gave him legal control over neighborhood decisions. The worst part was watching Margaret's face as she processed that her protection of the neighborhood had been its systematic destruction by an outside profiteer who'd been manipulating her mental health issues and unresolved grief for his financial gain. Federal intervention. Robert's phone rang again, and this time, Agent Williams's voice was even more urgent and specific about the charges they were facing. "Hayes, we have warrants for both you and Margaret Whitmore related to Operation Willow. The embezzlement charges alone are going to put you away for 20 years. But the federal database access violations and the systematic targeting of families with federal health care funding could add another 30 years to your sentence." Robert looked round at the crowd of neighbors, at Detective Rodriguez taking notes, at Sarah recording everything, and at me finally understanding how my family had been targeted as part of a much larger criminal conspiracy. Margaret, we need to run right now. I don't understand what we were trying to accomplish here, and they're going to twist everything we did into some kind of criminal enterprise. But Margaret wasn't looking at Robert anymore. She was looking at Emma, and the expression on her face was something I'd never seen before. It's cold and calculating and dangerous in a way that made every parental protective instinct I had start screaming warnings. "You know what I just realized?" Margaret said, her voice taking on a strange, dreamy quality that made Detective Rodriguez's hand move instinctively toward his weapon. "If that little girl hadn't gotten sick, if your family hadn't moved here with all your medical drama and your sad story about cancer treatment, none of this would have happened. Everything was perfect before you brought your tragedy into our community." The way she was looking at Emma, like my daughter was personally responsible for Margaret's entire world falling apart, made me step between them instinctively. The final confrontation, 2 black SUVs pulling into our driveway, wasn't exactly how I'd pictured Emma's birthday party ending. But at this point, nothing about this day was following any script I could have imagined. Agent Rebecca Williams stepped out of the lead vehicle with the kind of professional calm that suggested she'd been watching our neighborhood drama unfold. From a distance, waiting for exactly the right moment to make her entrance, she flashed her badge to Detective Rodriguez, who nodded like he'd been expecting this development, and then walked directly to Robert Hayes with the confidence of someone holding all the cards. "Mr. Hayes, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement of federal funds, racketeering, and unauthorized access to classified Department of Veterans Affairs databases containing sensitive military family information." The mention of VA databases sent a chill through the crowd because suddenly this wasn't just about community harassment or real estate fraud. This was about national security breaches involving military families. Agent Williams continued reading charges that painted a picture of systematic federal crimes spanning multiple agencies. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're also under arrest for conspiracy, embezzlement of private insurance funds totaling $2.7 million, and accessory to federal database violations involving classified military medical records." Confusion was genuine and devastating. $2.7 million? Military records? I never embezzled anything, Robert. Tell them this is about community standards. But Robert was already being read his Miranda rights, and the look on his face suggested that throwing Margaret under the bus had been his plan all along. The truth about Sarah stepped forward, revealing herself as something other than just Emma's doctor, Mr. Davidson. "I owe you an explanation," she said, her voice carrying genuine regret. "The FBI approached me 6 months ago about suspicious patterns in classified database breaches affecting military families receiving federal medical assistance. Your family's harassment matched a pattern it identified in 20 other congressional districts where veterans families were being systematically targeted using illegally accessed government data. The revelation that we'd been part of a federal sting operation involving national security crimes should have made me angry. But after months of feeling helpless, learning that someone had been building a case was mostly relief." Agent Williams opened a thick folder and began reading charges that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. "Mrs. Whitmore, you used classified federal data provided by Mr. Hayes to identify military families, veterans with PTSD, families with children receiving specialized medical care through VA programs, and families dealing with service disabilities. You then used that classified information to target them for systematic harassment, making their lives so miserable they'd sell their properties below market value to shell companies, controlled by Robert Hayes' development group." Each word was revealing layers of federal crimes that went far beyond simple fraud into systematic targeting of military families, the deeper betrayal. But the most devastating revelation was still coming. Robert, deciding that cooperation was his only chance at avoiding life in federal prison, started talking before his lawyer could stop him. The Sunset Ridge Development Project was just a cover for Operation Silent Valley, a classified NSA surveillance program that I was selling information from to foreign real estate investors. I needed families to sell their properties quickly and quietly, so I used Margaret to create systematic harassment campaigns that would force military families out of neighborhoods where the NSA had established surveillance infrastructure. Margaret's face showed complete betrayal as she realized she'd been unknowingly participating in what amounted to espionage against American military families. Agent Williams turned to Sarah with professional respect. "Dr. Mitchell, your cooperation with this investigation has been invaluable. The federal sting operation allowed us to document not just the local fraud scheme, but the classified database access and NSA surveillance data theft that connects this case to foreign intelligence operations targeting American military infrastructure." Sarah looked at me with guilt. "Jackson, when the FBI showed me the scope of Robert's classified database access, I knew we had to stop him. Your family was specifically selected because Robert's research showed that your neighborhood contained crucial NSA surveillance infrastructure, and he needed all the military families cleared out to sell that intelligence to foreign buyers. The espionage network, the revelation that our neighborhood had been targeted because it contained classified NSA surveillance infrastructure, was the twist that changed everything. Margaret hadn't just been harassing families for property values. She'd been unknowingly participating in espionage, systematically targeting American military families to clear them away from classified government surveillance equipment that Robert was planning to expose to foreign intelligence services. Operation Silent Valley involved selling locations and technical specifications of classified NSA surveillance infrastructure to Chinese and Russian intelligence services. Agent Williams continued. Mr. Hayes needed those neighborhoods cleared of military families who might notice unusual activity around government equipment installations. That's when Margaret's composure finally shattered, as she realized what she'd been manipulated into doing. "You told me these families were security risks. You said they were bringing foreign influence into our community. You made me believe I was protecting America." But Robert's response was the final betrayal. "Margaret, you were the perfect weapon because you believed it. I needed someone who would target military families without questioning the mission. Someone whose personal trauma would make them ruthless enough to clear out American veterans and their children for foreign intelligence operations." The revelation that she'd been systematically betraying American military families while believing she was protecting them sent Margaret completely over the edge. Margaret's breakdown the moment Margaret said those words about protecting America while unknowingly betraying military families. Sarah stepped protectively in front of Emma, and I saw something in the doctor's eyes that I'd never seen before. Not the calm medical professional who'd guided us through cancer treatment, but something harder, more dangerous. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're talking about espionage against American military families in front of federal agents, local police, and about 30 witnesses. I strongly suggest you stop talking and request a lawyer immediately." But Margaret was beyond rational advice now. Lost in some twisted logic where my daughter's survival and our family's happiness had somehow contributed to a national security breach she'd never known she was participating in. "Don't tell me what I can and can't say. You people with your perfect lives, your medical degrees, your political connections, your federal protection, you think you understand loss? You think you understand what it's like to lose everything because Robert convinced me that targeting military families was protecting America from foreign threats." That's when Margaret began telling us the real story, the one behind all her rage and manipulation. The personal trauma that Robert had identified and weaponized for his espionage operation. My son Tommy was 6 years old when he drowned in our backyard pool. 6 years old. And I was inside the house drunk on wine at 2 in the afternoon because I couldn't handle being a mother anymore. I heard the splash. I heard him calling for me. And I finished my glass of wine before I went outside to check. The confession hit the crowd like a physical blow, the kind of truth that makes everyone wish they hadn't heard it. Pulled him out, it was too late. The paramedics tried for 40 minutes, but my baby was gone because I chose alcohol over my child's safety. So don't lecture me about understanding loss when Robert told me that your military family connections were bringing foreign surveillance into our neighborhood. And I believed I was protecting other children by targeting you. The full truth of revelation explains so much about Margaret's behavior. Her obsession with controlling other families, her particular cruelty toward families dealing with medical crises, and how Robert had been able to manipulate her. psychological vulnerabilities for his espionage operation. She wasn't just enforcing community rules or even participating in real estate fraud. She was punishing other parents for being better than she had been, for saving their children when she had failed to save hers. And Robert had been feeding her classified military data to convince her that targeting military families was protecting America from foreign threats. Robert, still in handcuffs, but unable to resist one final manipulation, looked at Margaret with something approaching pity. "Margaret, you never told me about the drinking or the specific circumstances of Tommy's death. You said he died in an accident, that you weren't even home when it happened. If I'd known you were struggling with guilt, addiction, and suicidal ideation, I might have approached our partnership differently and used less classified information in your targeting assignments." But Agent Williams had been taking notes throughout Margaret's breakdown, and her response was swift and merciless. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you confessing to child endangerment resulting in death, filing false police reports about the circumstances of your son's death, insurance fraud related to his accidental death claim, and providing false information to federal investigators about your mental state during classified database violations?" The federal agent was building a case in real time, using Margaret's emotional confession to pile additional charges onto an already devastating indictment that now included national security crimes.